the social aspects and differences in the economies for the colonies. There are your Bellward questions that are up on Classroom. Okay, so in the early 1600s, early settlers faced brutal conditions, dropping from deadly diseases, starvation, and frontier conflict. Yet once the colonies established a foothold, the population exploded like a viral trend, doubling roughly every 25 years. And by 1750, the colonial population crosses the 1 million mark. And by 1775, we're sitting at around somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5 million people by best estimates. Compare that to the entire British Isles, England, Scotland, and Ireland combined, which sat around 6.5 million people. So in 1766, one British visitor predicted America would become the most prosperous empire the world had ever seen, though he openly doubted Britain could hold on to the reins of it for all time. Benjamin Franklin pointed out the secret cheat code behind this insane growth rate: massive amounts of cheap land and a desperate demand for labor. Unlike crowded Europe with its high rent, and America meanwhile had endlessly open space where having a giant family was the ultimate economic strategy, and his kids provided that essential farm labor. Because land was accessible, colonial families formed much earlier than in Europe, and while English women typically married around age 25 or 26, American women were marrying around the age of 20, giving them a much wider window for pregnancy, often giving birth every 2 to 3 years on average. Benjamin Franklin himself grew up with 16 siblings. However, this demographic boom came at a terrifying physical cost. Childbirth was an extremely high-risk mission conducted at home in very unsanitary conditions at the time, and up to 50% of women died from childbirth complications, and nearly a quarter of infants died before their first birthday. In the early Chesapeake, half of all children won't make it to the age of 20, and even elite families lost children constantly. Boston minister Cotton Mather, for instance, buried 8 of his 15 kids in infancy, and Martha Washington lost all 4 children from her first marriage at young ages. Surprisingly, despite these horrifying statistics, overall mortality rates were actually lower in North America than they were in Europe at the time. By the mid-1600s, a kid in New England had a much higher chance of reaching adulthood than a kid in London. Plentiful farmland meant that there were 0 famines, dense forests provided infinite firewood to survive brutal winters, and a younger population meant fewer vulnerable people catching these debilitating illnesses. Plus, because settlements were spread out across a vast wilderness rather than crammed all together, contagious diseases didn't really spread the same way they did in big towns like London or Paris. It was only later in the mid-1700s, as colonial cities grew more crowded, that disease rates would actually start matching that of their European counterparts. So by the mid-18th century, as the colonial population expanded like a rapidly filling multiplayer lobby in Fortnite, early strains of nativism, a very deep-seated hostility towards foreign-born immigrants, began to take root. Now think about how very little this makes sense. We're talking about people who themselves are immigrants, or the first people born from their family in the country, and yet they already hate people that were born in other countries. It's pretty ridiculous. Even Pennsylvania, a colony originally constructed by William Penn as the ultimate sanctuary for the persecuted, started stressing over massive demographic shifts. The sheer volume of non-English newcomers arriving on American shores triggered intense social anxieties amongst the established English-speaking elites, proving that xenophobia is definitely not a modern invention. Ben Franklin himself was deeply paranoid about the rising influx of German settlers, famously blasting German immigrants, calling them the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation, and venting about how they had formed isolated communities while refusing to learn English. He openly questioned why Pennsylvania, an English-founded territory, should suffer becoming a colony of aliens. Franklin argued that if the Germans were going to stay, they need to be forcibly dispersed throughout all the colonies, like scattered NPCs, rather than allowed to cluster in power blocks in different regions of the state. Shortly after, as waves of impoverished Irish and Scots-Irish immigrants landed, social prejudice expanded to target them as well, as a young Franklin recalled watching a ship dump Irish arrivals into New York City, and he was wondering how wealthy passengers survived being trapped with such a lousy, stinking rabble as those dirty Irishmen. It was a complete upgrade, though, for Irish immigrants in New York riding back to their home and begging them to tell the other folk in the town and such about how much better life was over here and the freedom that they were experiencing. So while British North America boasted a much higher population of women than Spanish or French colonies, female settlers were strictly locked out of social and political equality. New England ministers openly declared women to be weak creatures lacking mental strength, insisting that their sole purpose was to be housewives and basically produce children. And the only Boston Governor John Winthrop went as far as to claim that a true wife could only find joy in total subjugation to her husband's authority. This rigid patriarchal hierarchy felt like being forced to play a simulation game like The Sims on the hardest difficulty setting, where your character has zero custom choices, no inventory rights, and a pre-scripted storyline that you have to follow no matter what. Under colonial law, women possessed no legal rights. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold public office. They weren't allowed to attend school. They couldn't sign contracts, and they couldn't own property. If a woman sought a divorce, which was only granted through extreme cruelty or abandonment, the father automatically received full custody of the children. Yet despite having zero institutional power, women performed the most grueling physical labor in the entire colony. Farm women rose before dawn to build fires, haul water, cook meals, tend to the livestock, grow gardens, and manufacture everyday survival goods like soap, candles, and clothing. In the South, female indentured servants worked brutal hours in tobacco fields right along enslaved laborers, and for impoverished women trapped in port cities with no safety net, prostitution became a desperate survival mechanism. Authorities treated these women harshly, and in Boston, women caught in disorderly houses were stripped to the waist, tied to a cart, and publicly whipped through the streets. So, however, a few extraordinary women did manage to shatter these rigid gender constraints out of sheer necessity and intellect, such as Eliza Lucas Pinckney. When her father inherited 3 South Carolina plantations and was suddenly called away to Antigua, the 17-year-old Eliza was left behind in total control of the estates and the enslaved workforce. Fascinated by botany, she successfully cultivated indigo, transforming it into a massive cash crop that boosted the entire regional economy. And when she married rich politician Charles Pinckney, she made him explicitly promise she could keep managing her agricultural empire. And when he dies 14 years later, she took over his massive estates as well, proving that even in a strictly male-dominated world, talent could break through the ceiling. So in the 18th century, religious life was strictly gatekept by male leadership across every single denomination, as Puritan ministers routinely pointed to biblical passages that argued that virtuous women were obligated to submit to male authority and stay dead silent during church business. If a woman dared to publicly challenge a minister's sermon, she wasn't just debated, she was put on trial, branded a heretic, and potentially banished from the community. Think of it like playing an old school multiplayer game where your character class is permanently muted by the server admins and locked out of all the guild leadership roles. Yet, despite being systematically silenced, women filled the benches, managed community charity, and kept the spiritual heartbeat of the colonies alive. And for black women, the spiritual landscape looked entirely different and far more complex, because in many West African societies, women were respected as powerful priests, shamans, healers, and spiritual leaders. So while some enslaved Africans had encountered Christianity or Islam before migration to the forced migration to the States, most worked tirelessly to keep their ancestral West African traditions alive in the Americas through the preservation of music, storytelling, and various spiritual rituals, passing them down from generation to generation despite the brutal surveillance of the plantation owners. Interestingly enough, the massive shortage of European women in the early colonial period gave them a unique leverage point, gradually improving their legal standing over time. Because Puritan society placed a huge emphasis on maintaining a well-ordered family, local courts actually passed laws to protect the wives from physical abuse and allowed for divorce in extreme cases of abandonment, and colonial legal code even began granting women greater control over the property they brought into a marriage or inherited as widows. So in Spanish Florida, enslaved Africans found a completely different legal and religious landscape than in the British colonies. Because the Spanish crown tied freedom directly to Roman Catholicism, officials declared in 1623 that any enslaved person escaping British territory who converted to the Catholic religion and joined the colonial militia would earn total freedom. Many freedom seekers fleeing Georgia and South Carolina also forged alliances with the Creek and Seminole nations, effectively creating a real-life Assassin's Creed-style underground network that left British slave catchers completely helpless to reclaim them. Back in the British Chesapeake, though, the institution of slavery underwent a very sinister transformation. Initially, Africans were treated like European indentured servants who could earn their freedom after set contract periods, but as tobacco, rice, and indigo cash crops exploded, planters faced a massive labor shortage while the supply of European indentured servants completely dries up. Colonial assemblies responded by patching the legal systems, writing ruthless slave codes that locked black laborers into permanent hereditary chattel slavery, and South Carolina declared all Africans and their future children to be enslaved for life, while a 1667 Virginia law banned enslaved people from serving on juries, traveling anywhere without permission, or gathering in groups. Virginia even passed a 1669 law stating that if a master killed an enslaved person during correction, it wasn't considered to be a crime. By 1700, enslaved Africans became the largest demographic arriving in the colonies, outnumbering European immigrants by a number of 5 to 1, and this tragic evolution was fueled by the booming transatlantic slave trade. So white Caribbean sugar islands like Jamaica and Portuguese Brazil imported millions of captives, and British mainland planters increasingly preferred enslaved Africans over indentured servants or Native Americans. Native Americans knew the local terrain and could escape easily, whereas dark-skinned Africans were visibly isolated, had no legal rights, and were viewed by colonial elites as the ultimate reliable economic asset. And in the eyes of colonial law, human beings had been completely recoded into permanent economic prosperity. So if we were to answer this question, we might say something like, women were expected to focus on domestic duties with limited rights in legal and economic matters. In New England, laws protected wives from extreme abuse, but in the South, indentured and enslaved women often worked in the fields. Upper-class women like Eliza Lucas Pinckney had more opportunities in business, but overall societal norms reinforced the idea that women were subordinate to men. And regional variations existed, but across the colonies, women were expected to prioritize their roles as wives and mothers. So by 1750, around 250,000 enslaved Africans lived in British America, the massive majority, roughly 150,000 of which were forced to work in Virginia and Maryland, while South Carolina and Georgia held around 60,000. In fact, white Southern farmers openly admitted they wouldn't even attempt to settle a new frontier land without enslaved labor. So as their numbers grew, so did their expertise. Enslaved workers weren't just field hands, they became skilled blacksmiths and carpenters, bricklayers, harbor pilots, midwives, and domestic workers. They also were essentially the ultimate irreplaceable players, carrying the entire colonial infrastructure on their backs. Hello? Okay. Okay, so yet because slaveholders were hyper aware of this dynamic, they had to maintain control through pure unadulterated terror. Planters instituted brutal physical punishments like public whippings, brandings, and maimings for even the smallest of offenses. Thomas Jefferson famously observed this toxic environment on his father's plantation, noting that every new generation of white children was nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny. In rice and sugar growing regions where black populations actually outnumbered the whites, plantation owners forced enslaved people to carry movement passes and paid poor white neighbors to run night patrols like dystopian enforcers. Despite their relentless surveillance, enslaved black individuals fought back every single day using stealth tactics straight out of an espionage game, as many engaged in quiet sabotage like slowing down the workforce, damaging tools, feigning illness, stealing food, and others boldly tried to run away. Newspaper ads from the era reveal slaveholders frantically searching for runaways like Mingo, a 46-year-old man who escaped alongside his wife, Ponte, and their 3-year-old son. Skilled English-speaking runaways often tried to pass as free citizens in the bustling colonial cities, and white planters lived in this constant paranoid fear of massive violent uprisings, and while large-scale rebellions were insanely difficult to coordinate under total surveillance, occasional revolts did explode, such as the Amherst County uprising where a brave slave killed 4 whites. Through sheer determination, though, enslaved people continually pushed back, claiming small crucial victories like securing Sundays as a non-negotiable day of rest. So while we usually associate colonial slavery with sprawling southern farms, northern cities relied heavily on enslaved labor as well. So in fact, ethnically diverse New York City had more enslaved people than any other American city, ranking second only to Charleston in its overall percentage by 1750. But as the black population grows, white city dwellers became increasingly paranoid, fearing that an organized revolt could destroy their urban center at any given moment. That paranoia wasn't entirely baseless, as enslaved people routinely fought back against their captivity, and in 1712, several dozen enslaved New Yorkers revolted by setting fires and attacking white citizens who came to put them out. So the colonial militia crushed the uprising, capturing 27 people, 6 of whom died by suicide before trial, while the rest were executed. And in response, New York passed a strict citywide black code to strip away any and all basic freedoms. So yet this resistance couldn't really be outlawed. By March 1741, a series of mysterious fires, including one at the governor's mansion, sent the city into full-blown panic, resembling the plot of a psychological thriller, as a 16-year-old indentured servant named Mary Burton claimed that enslaved men and poor whites were conspiring to burn down the entire town under the leadership of a rogue trader named John Hewson. The resulting hysteria, known as the Conspiracy of 1741, saw over half of the city's adult enslaved male population jailed, and by the time the panic cleared, 17 enslaved people and 4 whites were hanged, 13 black men were burned at the stake, and dozens more were deported to the Caribbean Sugar Islands. Meanwhile, in the South, the largest mainland uprising erupted in 1739 in the form of South Carolina's Stono Rebellion. Exploiting a geopolitical war between Britain and Spain, Catholic Spanish Florida offered freedom to any fugitive slave who made it to St. Augustine. And in September, around 75 enslaved Africans, many of them Portuguese-speaking Catholics from the Kingdom of the Congo, with actual military training, rose in revolt near the Stono River, marching towards Florida like a disciplined military unit with colors displayed and drums beating. They fought bravely before they were overwhelmed by the heavily armed, mounted South Carolina militia. 44 rebels were killed, and a terrified colonial legislature immediately slashed slave importations and tightened plantation discipline, proving that while enslaved people faced impossible odds, their desire for freedom could never be truly extinguished. So by the mid-18th century, the 13 colonies were leveling up rapidly, expanding their infrastructure and establishing schools and colleges. Standards of living was shooting upwards and allowing colonists to read the latest books and political ideas floating out of London and Paris. So while wealthy urbanites began flooding the market with European luxury goods, fine silk clothing, ornate jewelry, and those iconic beaver hats, but this spending spree highlighted a massive social divide, turning cities into high contrast zones between the ultra-rich and the struggling working class. Naturally, local ministers were furious, publicly roasting the wealthy for trading Christian humility for high fashion. And as early as 1714, one Boston resident complained that people were severely overspending on flex items just to keep up with the local elite. Adding to all this drama, British merchants demanded payment exclusively in gold or silver coinage, triggering a severe shortage of hard currency across the Atlantic. And since the colonies couldn't just print infinite digital currency, colonial merchants turned to a classic barter economy, using cash crop commodities like tobacco and rice as everyday money. While most colonists remained rural farmers managing their own modest setups, a few bustling port cities do emerge as political and economic server hubs of North America. Like New York City became famous for their hyper-competitive financial grind, with one European visitor noting that making money was the single highest priority for the residents of the city. So by the end of the colonial era, Philadelphia had grown into a massive metropolis of 30,000 residents, making it the undisputed capital of the colonies, followed by New York at 25,000, Boston at 16, and Charleston at 12, while Newport came in at around 11. So, as colonial cities continued to grow, a strict social hierarchy took shape. At the top was the wealthy merchants and property owners, supported by the middle class of shopkeepers and skilled artisans, a group that made up 2/3 of all urban male workers. These were the blacksmiths, silversmiths, cobblers, stonemasons who literally built the physical world. And at the bottom were sailors, manual laborers, servants, and enslaved workers carrying the heaviest physical burdens. Because cities were densely packed, life was chaotic, and outbreaks of things like cholera and yellow fever wiped out entire neighborhoods, while frequent fires forced citizens to build early fire companies. As rising poverty hit hard too, Boston saw its poor receiving public aid jump from 500 in 1700 to 4,000 by 1736. So to escape the grime, colonists flooded into the local taverns, which rapidly evolved into the most important social institution in North America. Not just places to go and drink cider or rum. Think of the Colonial Tavern as a real-life town square in The Witcher 3, where you would go to get quests, catch up on gossip, read local news, and debate politics. Traveling at night was dangerous, so inns and taverns provided essential food and shelter for weary travelers. And while some ministers worried that excessive drinking would lead to a total societal breakdown, taverns became democratic mixing pots where people from all different social classes rubbed elbows with one another. And by the mid-18th century, these rowdy establishments morphed into political nerve centers where colonists plotted protests against British rule. Long-distance communications, however, remained a pretty massive hurdle. Before an organized system existed, people handed letters to random travelers or sea captains, hoping their messages didn't get lost in the transit. That changed in 1710 when Parliament established a colonial postmaster, creating a structured postal network along the Atlantic coast. And this new postal grid acted like the ultimate bandwidth upgrade for the colonies, as it allowed for newspapers to proliferate and circulate rapidly and spread revolutionary political ideas like wildfire, connecting isolated towns into a unified network ready to challenge the imperial authority. So, in 18th century Western Europe, monarchs and state churches believed that allowing religious diversity would instantly destroy society and cause total anarchy, but Pennsylvania completely flips the script, proving that freedom of conscience could actually lead to incredible stability and economic growth. So instead of relying on aggressive government police, the founding Quakers enforced strict moral behavior through social self-discipline, and they held regular community meetings that acted like a local moderation team, making sure members stayed on the right path. They even had rules requiring young couples to own land and livestock before they got married, ensuring that the family stayed financially secure, though this made it tough for poor Quakers who either stayed single or left the sect entirely. But by the 1740s, Pennsylvania's massive success caused a big demographic shift, turning the Quakers into a minority in their own colony, and newly arrived Scots-Irish Presbyterians who settled on the dangerous frontier began demanding an aggressive military strategy against local natives, which clashed directly with the Quakers' core pacifist beliefs. So to keep control, the Quaker politicians pulled off a classic strategy move, forming a political alliance with German religious groups, but this triggered intense political rivalry with the Scots-Irish, creating serious instability for the colony. And even as factional drama erupted in places like New York and Pennsylvania, colonists generally agreed on two major ideas. Economic opportunity was essential, and no government should control your personal religious beliefs. And that is where we get the Great Awakening, a massive spiritual movement rooted in European pietism, a Christian revival that focused on intense emotion and a deep personal connection with God. German migrants brought these ideas to the Americas in the 1720s, sparking local revivals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, led by the passionate preachers like William Tennant and Theodore Jacob Freelandhuisen. Soon, Massachusetts minister Jonathan Edwards started guiding powerful revivals across the Connecticut River Valley, and his published accounts spread like wildfire across the Atlantic, proving that international communication networks were already connecting the English-speaking world. And then we have George Whitefield, an English minister who essentially acted as the ultimate rock star influencer of the 18th century, as he transformed local revivals into these massive national phenomenon, traveling from Georgia all the way to Massachusetts, preaching to outdoor crowds that had tens of thousands of people in them. And Whitefield didn't just stand behind a wooden pulpit reading dry notes. He brought theatrical drama, emotional gestures, and booming vocal delivery in his sermons, leaving audiences completely spellbound. And his followers, dubbed New Lights, embraced this new passionate style of faith and eagerly spread the message everywhere they went. And through the published sermons and constant travel, Whitefield linked isolated colonies into a unified central network, laying the groundwork for a more shared American identity. There's George Whitefield delivering a sermon. If we were to answer this question, we might say that the Great Awakening, driven by the Pietist movement, had significant social and political impacts by challenging traditional religious authority, which also gives rise to the idea of challenging traditional colonial authority. So it unified different regions and ethnic groups like the German Pietists, the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, the New England Puritans, under shared religious fervor. These movements not only reshaped religious practices, but fostered greater political awareness and resistance to colonial elites and British authority. So when the Great Awakening exploded across the colonies, it doesn't happen without a fight. Conservative traditional ministers, whom the passionate evangelists mockingly labeled the Old Lights, were furious about the emotional chaos of the revivals. They couldn't stand the public crying, fainting, and convulsing, and they openly scoffed at claims of miracles and speaking in tongues. Think of it like veteran players throwing a massive temper tantrum because a new patch completely changed the meta, introducing wild, unpredictable mechanics that they didn't really understand how to use. A prominent Boston minister named Charles Chauncey led the charge against the New Lights, losing his mind over the fact that they actually allowed women to speak in public. And to Chauncey and his allies, this was a blatant violation of traditional rules requiring women to remain silent in church. And in places like Connecticut, panicked Old Lights used their political influence to pass strict laws requiring itinerant preachers to get official permission before speaking to any congregation. But the New Lights refused to be silenced, and ordinary farmers, women, and artisans packed up, traveled across the countryside, challenged the establishment, and proudly accepted imprisonment for their faith. The movement fundamentally fractured established state-supported churches, and in New England, thousands of New Lights walked out of the Congregational Church to launch 125 independent separatist churches funded entirely by voluntary contributions. Others joined Baptist congregations, which also fiercely opposed government-backed religion, and even the Dutch Reformed Church in New York and New Jersey split right down the middle as members rejected conservative doctrine dictated from overseas. Because traditional churches suffered from a massive shortage of university-trained pastors, leaving half the pulpits vacant, and itinerant preachers had to step in, arguing that a minister's authority came from a personal conversion experience rather than a fancy degree. As religious enthusiasts surged, communities began founding elite colleges like Princeton, Columbia, Brown, and Rutgers to train future leaders. Ultimately, the greatest legacy of the Great Awakening wasn't just building schools for the elite, it was teaching the everyday public that they had the power to claim their own spiritual authority. All right, so in the southern colonies, the Church of England was the mandatory state-backed religion, but Anglican ministers completely ignored enslaved black people and landless white families who made up 40% and 20% of the population respectively. And the Anglican Church was controlled by wealthy planters who used their money like high-ranking server admins to censor preachers. And if a minister dared to preach against the vices of the local gentry, he risked being instantly kicked off of the server. Planters flaunted their social dominance by rolling up to the church in a fancy horse-drawn carriage, taking the front pews, turning Sunday service into a high society flex. Starting in 1743, ordinary people began pushing back, and Samuel Morris, a humble bricklayer inspired by George Whitefield, led Virginia Anglicans out of the state church to form their own prayer groups, inviting New Light Presbyterian Samuel Davies to preach. Davies' emotional sermons rocked the Tidewater region, threatening the social elite's grip on society. Then in the 1760s, the Baptists arrived, creating a massive cultural shift as well, as Baptists practiced adult baptism through public full immersion ceremonies where believers were emotionally born again, and they openly welcomed enslaved Africans who embraced a message of absolute equality before God. Baptists completely rejected social classes, addressing each other as brother and sister, while condemning the wealthy planters' gambling, dancing, and ostentatious lifestyles. Panicked by the threat to their power and the institution of slavery, Virginia's gentry responded with heavy legal fines and brutal violence, as Anglican posses literally attacked Baptist ministers like Brother John Waller mid-prayer. Yet despite the physical beatings, the Baptist movement exploded as Baptist men embraced an evangelical style of masculinity, weeping and groaning publicly in response to the Holy Spirit. And by 1775, 15% of Virginia's white population and many enslaved black people had joined Baptist churches. By extending Christianity to enslaved people, Baptist revivals began bridging the deep cultural divide between black and white Southerners, laying the groundwork for African Americans to forge their own distinct religious traditions in the future.